Welcome everyone to another Giraffe tutorial. Today we're going to be talking through the Annotate tab up the top here and also the Measure tab alongside it. So I've got a project here in front of me, a fictitious project that I've developed up for this training purpose, and I've dropped a number of annotations around the site to better communicate my story and what I'm trying to achieve through my project. So annotations is a great way to add further depth to your project, to communicate to other stakeholders and what you're trying to achieve. So you can see as I scroll around, there's a number of sort of key metrics that I'm highlighting here. There's a connection through to the park, which I've added a dashed arrow here, and identifying the different usages or different types that I've included in my design, such as the retail, commercial, and the residential component. So let's dive in and start to talk to how we can create some of these annotations and dimensions that you see on the screen. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new drawing layer. I'm going to call this new Annotations, and we're just going to toggle off my Annotations layer because I've done a little bit of setting up and I've actually moved all of my annotations onto a single layer, which is quite nice to be able to turn that off in one go. So I'm going to navigate up to the Annotate tab, and the first one off the list is the text tool. So if I click the text tool here, we're pulled into this edit mode with the little black dot on my cursor, and I can drop that, and by default we get this little T in a circle. So when we click on that, we can actually get some properties on the left-hand side, which we can further format that text box. So there's a number of options here, the kind, so you can remove the background. I'm going to keep the background for this one and adjust it to the square shape. I'm not going to talk through all of these, but I'll give you an idea of how we can actually interact and transform this to suit your project. So let's say landscaping, the size, I'm sort of happy with that. I might change the color. Let's make this a green, drop that in. Text color, let's make that a white. And I'm going to remove the border, just personal preference there. I can actually prop it up on a little flagpole, which is quite nice. Just bringing some attention to that annotation. And I also want to toggle on world space. So you'll notice without toggling that on, if I zoom out now, that text stays the same size and grows as I zoom in and out. So which isn't ideal for what I'm trying to achieve for this project. So I'm actually going to toggle on world space, which will lock it in at that size. And so it'll only be visible once I zoom in to that level of detail. So I'm going to drop that there. I'm happy with that. That sort of gives a little bit of information about what's happening here on the project. So let's say that I wanted to add that annotation to the landscape, the elevated landscape up here. So I'm going to toggle into 2D mode. I'm just going to hold Option or Alt on your keyboard to copy that across. And if I toggle back into 3D mode, we can see that by default, that's positioned at the ground plane. So what we need to do there, and it's common within all geometry and how we interact, is we need to add a property to override those base default settings. And so I'm going to click on the landscaping annotation, and I'm actually going to navigate over to the properties panel and add an additional property. And this new property is called a base height. So if I type in base height, we can see that populate there. And what that means is you'll see it happen straight away, sort of bumped it off the ground. And we got a 10 meter default base height when we added that property. And so now if I sort of zoom into the same plane, we can see that's above the ground, but I need it a little bit higher. So let's say 24. That looks about right. Hit enter to save that. And now we've got our new landscaping tab that's positioned correctly on this elevated podium. And so the next aspect in my project that I want to highlight is I want to bring attention to this thoroughfare that I've created through from Union Street on that side through to the adjacent Harris Street and the park beyond. So the way we can do this is by adding further graphical elements to the project. And I'm going to navigate up to the Annotate tab up the top here, scroll down to dashed arrow is what I'm interested in. I'm going to toggle into 2D view just so I can have more control over that drawing. And I'm going to just click through and double click to finish. And now we get this arrow appear on the map that brings attention to the strategy that we're trying to implement here and we can further annotate that to communicate to stakeholders or other team members by adding annotations as well. So I can hold Alt or Option, drag that over here, and we can edit this text annotation. So maybe this is a pedestrian thoroughfare. And we might change the color as well. Let's make that maybe an orange. And I'm just going to adjust the flagpole height or the stick height down to 5. And that's a little bit better. And we might adjust this arrow as well. So when I click on the arrow, again, we've got those formatting properties on the left-hand side. So I can jump over here, and maybe we want to change that to an orange, for example. We can interact with the dash, and we can also interact with the line width as well. So you've got complete control over there in terms of the style of that arrow. And we can adjust that just like any geometry in Giraffe. So I can add nodes, I can remove nodes as well to suit what I'm trying to tell here. All right, so now I want to add a little bit more information to the building. So we've got a residential component here, and if I select that, we can see the usage over on the left-hand side is residential. And I want to add a little bit more information, but I want that information to also be dynamic. So if I decide to adjust these levels, that information will update and I get that real-time data. So the way we can do that is we need to add a marker property to this element. And so again, similar to what we did earlier by adding a property with the base height, and we lifted that annotation up with the landscaping annotation here, we can add a property to this geometry as well. So I'm going to navigate over to the properties panel. I'm going to add a property, and the one I'm looking for is a marker. So if I select marker here, we get an additional property added here on the left-hand side, and there's a number of controls within this group. So by default, we've got a text label that appears, and I can see that populated on the top of the building, which is nice. But if I wanted to add that dynamic element, we can actually edit that marker. And so I'm navigating over here to the edit marker content, and I'm going to click that. So what this does is open up a window, and we can see that we can actually interact with the properties associated with that geometry. So if I wanted to add, let's say, the GBA, so I can select the GBA. Maybe there is just looking through the list here, we can bring up the usage type as well. So it's a residential usage. And I think that's all we're going to bring up for this one. So if I just close that and I save my marker, so we get a little preview here. There's a GBA 18,578 and the usage is residential. So if I save that now, we can see that information is actually populated on top of the building. And I might format that a little bit just so we can see it a little bit clearer. And let's adjust the text. So maybe we drop it into something that looks a little bit like this, and then change the color. And maybe we'll actually make that a black. That looks a little bit better. All right, so we do have world space toggled off as well, and that's why, again, we see that the text size remains the same as we adjust that zoom level. So I'm just going to toggle that one on again. So now that's a little bit nicer, and we can see that information that's actually attached to the geometry. So if I click and drag this, it stays with that geometry. I'll just undo that. But what we can also do is if I start to adjust these levels, we can see that GBA start to update. And so now we're down to 14,000. And let's say, oh no, I need to add a few levels to this. So just using Q&A on my keyboard for the shortcut to adjust levels, I'm adding levels and growing that GBA, which we see reflected dynamically through that marker. All right, so now I'm going to move away from my site just for a moment. So there's actually some context that I want to include that talks directly to my site. We're talking about connectivity through pedestrian and also bike access. So I want to highlight that there's an existing bike path along the promenade of the Parramatta River here. And again, the best way we can do that is through those graphical arrows. So if I navigate again up into my Annotate tab, and maybe it's a minor arrow that I want to select this time. So I'm just toggling into 2D mode with T on my keyboard, and I just want to trace very sort of crudely along this bike path to highlight that as a part of my project. And then I'm going to double click to finish that, toggle back into 2D mode, and now we have a nice little explanatory element that talks to a bike path. However, we don't know that it is a bike path, so we can add further details to that. And so what I'm going to do is add a label. So the way I can do this is I've just selected that element, navigating up to my Annotate tab, and I'm going to add a label to the existing. So this is very similar. So I've got my crosshairs now, and I'm just going to select directly on the arrow, and we can see that label appear. So this is very similar to what we did with the marker. It is now attached to that arrow. So as I start to move that, we can see that that label is attached there and will carry with that element that we've drawn. So we can now interact with that label just like the marker property. So over here, we've got the marker property, and I'll just open that group, and we can add some text to further explain this bike path. So let's just call it a bike path. And again, we can adjust the color here. So blue is fine for now. And now I've got a little text annotation that is highlighting that this is a bike path. And we can also further communicate that with icons. So if I navigate up to the Annotate tab, there's a icon feature here. So if I select that, and let's say we'll drop a symbol here. By default, you get this little map location beacon, but I want to actually adjust that and load in my own icon. So you can absolutely bring in your own files into Giraffe. And the way you can do that is I've dropped in this by default, but on the left-hand side in the properties, we can actually change that. And so if I hit change here, I'm going to do a new upload, and I think I've got one on file. Once that loads, I've got a little bike here, so let's load that in. I'm going to bring it in as the largest size I can and save that image. So this is just an image I downloaded earlier, and now I'm going to use that file. And it is quite small, so let's adjust the size here, maybe make it 5. That's a little bit too big. Let's drop it down to 4. So that's a little bit better. Again, I'm going to toggle on world space as I don't want this element to grow. And now we've just given that arrow a little bit more information about itself, so someone at a glance can identify what we're trying to communicate here. And further to that strategy of trying to convey visually some surrounding context, let's imagine for a moment that there is a dog park that's proposed here in this little wedge. So we could absolutely create a usage or maybe just drop in a landscape element and overlap that there. However, we've got a feature that's called a filled region, which we can also add. So there's multiple ways to arrive at your end result. And I'm sort of just talking through some of the strategies and ways that I would recommend. So what I'm going to do is navigate again to the Annotate tool, and we've got the filled region function here. So if I click on the filled region, I'm going to navigate into 2D mode. And what I'm going to do is just roughly trace around this area here, as this is my proposed dog park. Let's capture all of that green area here. Double click to finish. Going to adjust that one. And so now what we've got is a nice filled region here that we can adjust. By default, we've got a label applied to it. We've got a dashed line, which is all editable. We can change this to suit our project needs. I'm happy with the orange. That sort of ties in with the rest of the theme of my project. And I can adjust that label as well. So let's jump in here. Proposed dog park. Hit enter. And now I'm just going to adjust the formatting of that as well. So again, I like the rectangle, and I'm going to adjust the color. So let's make it more of an orange. And then change this to a white and remove that border. And we can again prop it up on a flagpole if we like. drop that down to maybe a 4. And so now what we've got is, again, additional information that we're trying to communicate through our project, and all by simply adding some annotations and some filled regions there. And I'm going to talk through one more, which I think is quite nice, and that's the blurred line feature. So it's just another tool to allow you to use in your project. And this one's a nice one to highlight any sort of key arterial roads that might be of interest. And the way we can do that is if I navigate up to the Annotate tab, the blurred line is the one I want to look at here. So I'm going to select blurred line. I'm going to zoom out, toggle into 2D mode, and let's say George Street here is of interest, and I want to sort of highlight some information about this street here. So just tracing along, capturing the area that's relevant to my project, and toggling back into 3D mode. We can now see that we've got this blurred line and brings attention to George Street, so which we could further annotate and give more information as to why this street is of importance. All right, and the last thing I want to mention on the Annotate tab is the Upload 3D Model function. So we do support 3D models being ingested into Giraffe through the format of a GLTF or a GLB file. We can absolutely bring that in to further assist in your project, whether it's an adjoining or adjacent contextual building that you're wanting to load in, or whatever it may be, we can support that workflow. So I'm going to navigate to the Annotate tab. There's an Upload 3D model towards the bottom there. Going to select that. And if I sort of drop this cursor, by default, you get a nice little giraffe that loads in, and we can change that through the properties panel on the left-hand side. So you'll see there's a file 3D GLTF, and we can hit change here and upload a new GLTF, just like we did with the icon earlier. So, all right, so let's move our little giraffe over here, put him in the dog park. So now let's take a look at the measure tool. So I want to navigate up to the drawing toolbar, click on measure, and we've got two types of measurements here. So we've got temporary dimensions and areas. So if I grab the tape measure there, run it across this length of the site, double click to finish, it will actually disappear. So it's a quick way of arriving or finding out that dimension. And also the shortcut is M on your keyboard. So that's a nice little handy one when you're looking to quickly get a dimension from your project. The same with the area. So again, this is a temporary area. So if we sort of capture this square here over on Rob Thomas Reserve, we can see the area 5,370. And if I double click, that will actually be removed because it is, again, a temporary area dimension. If you are wanting to keep those dimensions on the site, I suggest you use the Annotate tool. So we've got Shift-D is the shortcut for there, or we can select directly through the Measure tool. And I'm just going to navigate into 2D mode. Let's snap to this corner here and this one here. Double click to finish. I don't need that extra tail of the dimension, so I'm just going to double click to remove that, and I'll drag that out. So now we've got our dimension, it stays there. We've got a dimension that's highlighted, and we can refer to that as we need throughout the project. Again, very similar to the temporary dimension, we've got an area function. So if I navigate into 2D mode again, and let's capture again this reserve over here, by default, it's a rectangle tool. We can, like all geometry in Giraffe, interact with that, add nodes if we need to transform that in any way. But what we get is each perimeter of this line, we get a dimension attached to that with also an area in the middle there. So that's the dimension tool and the Annotate tool. I hope that was of help to you guys in your projects, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.